Thanks very much, Mike, and thanks to Dan and RUSI for organising this excellent event. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about climate and the way that it interacts with existing risks for mineral supply, including geopolitics. But there is an upside here as well, because climate can prove a really powerful lens for the effective management of these risks, injecting urgency and coordination into an area that I think sorely needs it based on the comments that we've had in the last few panels. So, just a little bit of background on TMP before we get into it. We've been going since 2009, and we're specialists in the interaction of complex risks, including social, environmental, and security problems. And then for the last 10 years, we've focused very firmly on the way that near-term climate impacts will affect key systems and processes. We work on food security, biodiversity, and in the minerals space, we're undertaking a 3-year project across 15 key countries to build resilience across supply chains, working with a range of partners in the private sector, from government, and from research institutes and think tanks like RUSI. So, what do we do? What do we bring to this party that allows us to add real value? We have a very different view of climate risk, which we think the world is quite underprepared for. And we've come to this view through 3 innovations in the way that we produce and communicate climate data. So first, we focus on timeframes that really matter for decision makers. So rather than projecting off to 2040, 2050, 2100, we're very focused on the next 5 years to 2030, and then to a secondary degree, we also look out to 2035. And this means that we're actually dealing with urgent problems that require urgent solutions. Second, rather than communicate in terms of average changes in temperature and precipitation, we focus on extreme weather events, unseasonal weather patterns, and other forms of unpredictable weather that really make a difference to people's livelihoods and that really affect the operations of businesses. And last but not least, certainly the most important for this talk, is that we integrate climate data with a whole range of data on social, environmental, political, economic factors, because even with the megatrend like climate, context is king. If we want to understand vulnerability and opportunity, we need to have a complete view of how our system works. So bringing this to minerals, this map is something that we produced with the Global Association of Risk Professionals, and it picks out 35 key areas around the world for mineral production and processing. These areas are responsible for over 90% of lithium production, over 70% of cobalt production, and the majority of the production of a series of other key transition minerals. And what we can see is, firstly, the production of these minerals is very highly concentrated, and unfortunately concentrated in areas that are particularly exposed to climate risks. So we think, in the absence of significant preparation for these physical climate impacts and the repercussions that they will have, that we can expect mineral supply chains to be disrupted, potentially significantly, in the next 5 years, maybe sooner. So, talking a little bit more about the way that climate interacts with mineral supply. First, talking about disrupted production. The first thing that struck us when we started looking at critical minerals is just how concentrated they are. This table picks out 15 of the largest assets across some key commodities, and we can see that just 3 assets account for over 50% of the world's lithium production. Around 3 assets account for about half of the world's rare earth production. And even in base metals, we can see 4 or 5 assets accounting for about 10% of the world's production. This means that these assets are particularly exposed to localized extreme weather events. And it means that climate risks have a similar profile in terms of the impact on supply chains that some of the geopolitical risks we've been talking about have. And what we see down the right-hand column of this graphic is what is our projected increase in heat waves over the next 5 years. And you can see that for many of these assets, that's a really dramatic change, which will drive both work stoppages and also increased rates of conflict around these assets, given the established linkage between increased heat and conflict in security literature. Now, I want to be clear that this isn't a future problem. These disruptions are already happening, and these disruptions are increasing in frequency. Here we've picked out just a few instances, mainly from copper. There are many more, but you can see they have a very substantial impact. In some cases, reducing year-on-year output from mines by 25%, or in other cases, increasing the price of relatively niche metals like magnesium by over 7 times for short periods. So these are established problems, but they're likely to get significantly worse over the next few years. This graphic, again, shows the increase in heat waves across several countries, and the point that we really want to make is that this shift is radical and that we are largely unprepared for it at the moment. So, how does this actually affect the expansion of mineral supply chains? We need to get hundreds of new mines online, we need large numbers of new processing units. How does climate interact with that challenge? So this graphic provided by ERM shows the drivers of lead times for mines, which are around 15 years on average across commodities. And you can see that at the moment, sorry, my animations aren't quite right here. So you can see that at the moment, that extreme weather is not a particularly significant driver of delay. But over time, we expect that to increase substantially because climate and extreme weather events interact substantially with many of these other drivers of lead time extension. They, in particular, interact with leading ESG risks, and that includes health and safety issues, local stakeholder opposition or social license to operate, environmental issues such as tailings dams failures creating massive contamination problems as a result of increased flooding, as well as commercial and technical issues. So we can see that in the absence of preparation, climate factors could serve to drive out these lead times even further. The good thing is that climate can bring much more urgency and priority to these ESG issues that are currently generally seen as regulatory or compliance issues, but because of climate will increasingly become operational concerns that are at the core of people's business. So moving to more of a macro view, how could climate have a kind of delaying effect on the way that capital is allocated, the way that government takes leadership in this sector, and the way that supply chain actors drive expansion? Again, this is a picture where, in the absence of preparation, we can see climate contributing to many of these problems, but also it can provide a unifying force that can drive people in terms of urgency to more rapid investment, in terms of government leadership, in terms of strategic advantage, and for supply chain actors getting the support that they need from both government and investors. So moving on to geopolitics and trade, one of the kind of most important issues in this space. Indeed, this McKinsey graphic shows that geopolitical risk has been the most important driver in metals and minerals activities over the last couple of years. And that shows how a risk factor can be turned into a positive in terms of the urgency that it can bring to the sector. We can see that climate is a significant issue here, although this is mainly a focus on mitigation. What we'll see increasingly is the interaction between these risks. And this is most obvious when we think about China. So we've already heard that China dominates these supply chains, but we see that China is particularly exposed to climate-related risks. This graphic shows the overlay of water risks in China with key processing assets. And we've already seen several instances in which these processing assets have either been taken offline or had to reduce output, particularly because of drought, its impact on hydropower output, but also because of floods, heat waves, and other extreme weather events. So again, what's the positive side of this? The fact that China is particularly at climate risk means that there are going to be opportunities for processors in other countries that are more climate resilient. It provides a rationale for diversifying supply chains that is considerably less controversial and sticky than the geopolitical issues that we've seen so far. And then moving on to another issue that is quite important when we think about mineral supply and access is trade choke points. And here what we see is a graphic of the Panama Canal, We've already seen the Panama Canal seeing reduced throughput because of drought, and our data suggests again that this is likely to become significantly worse over the coming years. Again, there is an upside here. This provides a strong rationale for the shortening of supply chains, making them more resilient, supporting processes like recycling that can help to mitigate or avoid these risks entirely. These problems are not being priced in at the moment, which is one of the reasons that many of those technologies are not competitive at the moment. So bringing this home, how can climate actually help? How does this create an opportunity? And this really relates to shifting the way that incentives work in this space. So there are three areas where we think that climate can make a particular difference in a positive way. First, it can increase the urgency. It can provide a rationale for the expansion and the diversification of the upstream in mineral supply chains, from mines to processing diversification to supply chain resilience itself. And importantly, that urgency is actually consistent and predictable in a way that the urgency that we've seen coming from geopolitical fears is not. Second, it provides a data-driven way to prioritize the allocation of capital to companies, countries, and capacity gaps that ensure a high standards approach, because that high standard approach builds resilience across supply chains. Climate is a systemic risk, which means that we can bring in a wide range of different factors into that prioritization process, giving us a much more holistic view of the problem than the sorts of fairly arbitrary approaches that we've seen to prioritization to date. And then finally, because climate is a universal problem, it provides a sort of common enemy that people can cluster around to cooperate effectively. There are plenty of opportunities for win-win cooperation between stakeholders on climate, whether that's between companies and communities at a local level, or whether it's between countries on processing diversification at an international level. Again, this is an issue that's just much less controversial and sticky than many of the megatrends that are driving activity to date. So, finally, this graphic is kind of playful. The point that it makes is serious. Many of the improvements that we need to manage climate risks are things that we should be trying to do anyway, whether that's improving ESG standards, improving social cohesion, improving international relations. Again, this is a really effective, motivating force that we can actually understand through data and that provides strong opportunities for win-win cooperation. So climate, in the absence of preparation, is going to be a major problem. If we recognize the challenge that it poses to us and work together to solve it, it can be a significant opportunity. So thank you very much.